any size news at all.
The rivalry is not just about maps, of course, but about the growth of two behemoth economies and the different political paths they've taken. Our guest is Dr. Kadira Pethiagoda, a former advisor to the Government of Australia, a fellow at the Brookings Institute, a former visiting scholar at Oxford University, and a former diplomat representing Australia overseas. Not a bad CV for such a young man. Doctor, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. Tell the people, most of whom have no idea that there's a problem between India and China, what the proximate reason for the current standoff is.
So there's a disputed border between the two countries, and recently Chinese troops had begun building a road. Sorry, I should say there's a three-way sort of issue here. So Bhutan claims some of the land, which China also claims. And the Chinese troops had started building a road on that land. And India found that to be quite a sensitive issue for themselves, because that bit of land is connected to an area which they call the Chicken Neck, which is a narrow strip of land in India which connects India to its northeastern states. And if China were to have strategic access to that, it would spell quite a significant threat to India. So India then sent troops to the border and supported Bhutan's claims and Bhutan's complaints about China building that road. And then you've had incidences of stone throwing between the troops, and it's become a big sort of diplomatic stoush between the two major powers. In addition to the fact that it's close to that Chicken Neck area, also, there's
Quite
a lot
of big chicken.
Yes, yeah.
It's not. We're not talking that.
No, not a real chicken. Definitely true. But I guess also the area which in India's northeast has seen insurgents and separatists as well. So I think it's quite sensitive for India. But also there's a lot of symbolism associated with this. So if you look at both India and China as former colonies, I guess India's a former colony and China was sort of subjugated by the West for a long time. They both have this intense attachment to protecting their territory. And so they see that any sort of infringement on territory is it really riles up the people in both of those countries. And so for India, where it's a democracy, the government needs to act strong that it's protecting its territory. For China, the Communist Party's legitimacy lays partly on being able to maintain the territorial integrity of China. Obviously, you've got issues like Taiwan as well.
Yeah.
So the symbolic importance is very great for these two countries.
Well, China has more than one territorial conflict with more than one country. Of course, there are conflicts with Vietnam, there are conflicts with Taiwan, with Japan.
And the seas,
there's
yes.
conflict in the sea, there's conflict on the land. I return to my point. China isn't short of territory, so why is it so keen on expanding its territory or defending what it says is its territory that is disputed by other people?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, it's very interesting because you've got this sort of dual messaging going on. You've got, China having these conflicts with a lot of its neighbours, at the same time trying to project this peaceful rise of China rhetoric and the benevolent leader kind of rhetoric, where you've got the Belt and Road Initiative, where China tries to project itself as a peaceful leader and, employing a lot of, I guess, Confucian language in doing so. But at the same time, I guess it's trying to use a stick and carrot approach. So there are certain underlying tensions with India as well. And I think one of the major concerns for China with regard to India is if India were to ally with the United States and countries like Japan in efforts to contain China. And I guess that's one of China's greatest concerns, is that if there is some kind of a conflict with the United States, it may have its trade routes cut off, and India is in a very strategic position to do that in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah. And is this concern real, you think, with all the other things on Trump's agenda?
Yeah, well, I think the irony is that it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the
Yeah.
sense that if it does push India, then it makes it more likely that India will go towards the United States.
Yeah.
So it's quite a difficult issue for them to handle, I think.
Now, you describe India as a democracy, which up to a point everyone could agree with, though it's a very imperfect one. Many internal problems and rising tide of violence and fanaticism. You imply that China is not a democracy. I would argue it's a democracy of a different kind only. But the one thing you couldn't argue with is that these are two increasingly gigantic third world behemoths, huge beasts. And surely if they could get along with each other, they'd actually be able to better beat those who did colonize them, both in the past.
Yes, and I think that's some of the sort of intentions of China in a sense, in that it tries to, I guess, through the Belt and Road, it tries to unite a lot of the countries in Asia, and with itself as seen as the leader. And it is true in that as two rising developing countries, they have convergent interests in a lot of areas. So in addition to economic partnerships and trade, they both want, I guess, fairer global trade rules. They both want a greater say in international institutions and rulemaking. They want to reshape the global order. And I think most importantly, they both want a multipolar world order, where it's not just the West that purely dominates and other countries also can have influence. So there is a lot of potential for cooperation there, I think, if some of these sort of smaller specific issues were sort of gotten over.
Yeah, you see, the reason I ask, I'm wondering if someone's stirring it up, because if I look at it objectively, there is no good enough reason for China and India to be at each other's throats, even if at the moment it's just throwing stones. But I could see many reasons why another power would want to have them ranged against each other on the wonderful principle of divide and rule. You could think of nothing more perfect than the two greatest developing economies actually being enemies of each other.
Yes, and I mean, I think if you're talking about the United States, the Bush administration...
You got it. I told them you were a clever fellow.
10 points for you.
I mean, the Bush administration really went a long way in that. I mean, that and the rhetoric around that time was really that they're going to try and use India to balance China. And the Indo-US nuclear deal was an attempt to do that. Obama said that the India-US relationship will be one of the most important. So they're really laying out the red carpet to try and attract India. But I think the issue is that India has always had this, I guess, principle of strategic autonomy, being a post-colonial country, that it never seeks to ally with any particular country, but it will pursue its interests. So I think what India will do is use the United States when it needs to get leverage with China, against China. It will use China when it needs to get leverage against the United States, and they'll play that game.
Very smart.
It has been a paradoxical period, though. I mean, for many decades before you were around in your lofty positions, India was an historic ally of the then Soviet Union. As long as Congress were in power, you could generally say that India took a pro-Russian, pro-Soviet line in things. Modi, Hindu nationalist, of quite an extreme variety, has come to power now, consolidated, it would appear, his power. But he hasn't taken India entirely into the American orbit. I mean, he's made very successful visits to both China and to Russia. He's spreading his purchases of weapons and so on across many countries. Do you credit Modi, whatever other criticisms I might make of him, with a fairly savvy approach to international relations?
To a certain degree, I think he does have that, and I think he's continuing on a tradition of Indian foreign policy where they do try to take a savvy approach. I think that in the Nehru era that you mentioned, they were much more idealistic, and they had a lot of third world solidarity with Indonesia as well, and with the non-aligned movement. And I think even with China, they had a sort of good relationship until the war. So I think that since the end of the 90s, though, Indian leaders have traditionally taken a more strategic approach, and I think that's what Modi's been trying. So it's interesting that, you know, he's known in India for having a bad relationship with Muslims, and, you know, for his when he was the governor of the chief minister of Gujarat, and there were those riots there. But interestingly, he's paid so many visits to Middle Eastern Muslim countries, and he's built sort of strengthened India's ties with a lot of these Muslim countries. So he's kind of good at playing both sides a lot of the time.
India is what Russia used to be said to be, an enigma wrapped in a mystery, and so on. So the future, are the stones the limit, or might they start throw something hotter?
Well, I think I would say that it's unlikely that it would turn into a proper armed conflict. India is generally quite cautious when it comes to wars and military activity, even with, you know, a country which, like Pakistan, over which it has a great strategic advantage. And obviously with China, it's got a massive disadvantage. And I think China also is really seeking to contain some of these issues. So I guess it's just a matter of how they can sell a peaceful outcome to their domestic populations and have a sort of political gain and not be seen to be backing down. And I think the BRICS summit is coming up as well, which is an important...
That would be a good place to fix it. Exactly. Your Excellency, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you very much.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So in all honesty, I actually didn't know either about the standoff between China and India. So I looked around on the Twitter sphere and I couldn't find many people knowing about it. The few that were around are amongst Sadanand Dume saying China's harsh language on the Doklam standoff shows it has no intention of treating India as an equal. And Claudio Tecchio says Japan has, on August 18, expressed support for India's stand on its own, now more than 2 months old Doklam standoff with China.
Well, surprise, surprise. I mean, Japan is supporting India because it's against China. The US is supporting India because it's against
Again,
China.
right.
So it's all geopolitics. But the thing is, these confrontations can easily catch fire.
And that's all the tweets we've got time for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.